everyone. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel Wruble, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Dr. Yael Ziegler and I held a special event in Matan's Jerusalem branch in front of a live audience to mark reaching 100 episodes of the podcast. The following is a recording of that conversation where we spoke briefly about the podcast's origins and mostly about teaching Tanakh in the modern world. This event ran longer than our usual 30-minute format, but we decided to put it up in full form on the feed. See the show notes for timings of different sections of the conversation. Happy listening. I just wanted to thank Matan for enabling this project to happen, not just this evening, but the whole project of the podcast. I also want to thank all of those who make the podcast possible, sponsors in all different shapes and forms. I'll also just add that all sponsorship is always incredibly helpful. It really enables us to keep putting out great content and to keep growing and having the ability and the bandwidth to keep thinking and taking on new projects. And I also really want to thank, and I'm saying this also for those who will be listening who are not just physically with us today, I want to thank all the guests who come on to the podcast and really graciously give of their time. It's so not a given. This is, people are giving of their time, tarte mashma, and I really appreciate, and mostly, when people can't join, they're sad that they can't join. They're like, okay, write me back in 3 months, and mostly people, they get an email from me and they're excited about it. So I really appreciate all of the people who have been guests and will be guests on the podcast. And of course, ultimately, I want to thank all those who listen and who make this project something really worth continuing on a weekly basis. So
a growing number of listeners. And I watch that number. I watch it every week to see what's happening, to gain a pulse of what's working or what's not working. So that's just some opening thanks. I guess I really wanted to start by telling a little bit about the story of how the podcast began. And it was sort of a perfect storm of a number of factors. Unbeknownst to me, before COVID hit, a lovely couple had really wanted to put Matan out there through the podcast medium, and they had donated equipment to Matan to do podcast recording. The equipment was in the cupboard. If I have the story correctly, it was in the cupboard waiting for the right person to come and claim it. And I was at home in the winter of sort of the second COVID year. And I had, at that point, she was still a pretty small baby. I was a student much of the week, and we had moved back to the Gush Etzion area after an unsuccessful attempt at living in the South. And I was honestly trying to find myself a little bit professionally. And my husband, and I'm not embarrassed to say as a loving wife that most of the good ideas in my house actually come from my husband, that my husband said to me, I really think that you should start a podcast. And we're big podcast fans. We listen all the time. It's always, he and I listen to very different kinds of podcasts, but we're both big podcast fans. And he said to me, I really think like you have this in you. I think that this would be like a good medium for you. And so I thought a little bit more, and then I approached Chaya. And that's sort of where it began. And she said, well, it happens to be, we have all this equipment. If you could figure out what to do with it, then maybe this will be a go. And so the first 10 episodes, we actually had somebody else, a lovely woman who helped us produce. And she sort of did a lot of hand holding and helped me learn how to use the equipment and sort of the basics of editing. And after those episodes, I took over those aspects myself. We still work with an editor who's does an amazing job, and I really appreciate them as well. But the sort of the technical and the editing sort of is me and another person. That's sort of the team. And essentially what happened is that we started off sort of doing shorter series, and then a whole bunch of episodes in, we decided to go into the Parsha theme. That was at the encouragement of also people who love and support Matan, and it was a very good suggestion. And I guess I'll just say for me that I love podcasts.
Elle and I have spoken about this. We feel very differently. As the years have gone on, I feel more and more embarrassed in frontal teaching. Like there's something about it that I feel is much more vulnerable and exposing. And I think also I work with couples and women, both as Yotzat Halacha and also as a Madrichat Kalot, and there was something about that, the one-on-one format that I sort of started to love very much. There's also something very alluring about being able to talk Torah in your sweatpants. And that's not something that should be minimized. All those who taught through Corona also know how that was a gift. So there's something about the intimacy of a podcast conversation with somebody, but that you also get to reach a lot of people, and even more people than you would reach in a classroom. That really appeals to me. And I think also that I like the role of midwifing, as opposed to always having to be the one who is creating all aspects of it. I love being able to sort of like midwife or even sometimes birth it along with somebody else. So I feel like as this has developed, like those are roles that has sort of felt more natural to me over time. And so it's a medium that, I don't know, for me, maybe my favorite at this point in time.
Well, you're really good at it, Yosefa. And I'll take this opportunity on behalf of Matan and all of your listeners who love you to thank you for all the time and effort that you put into it. Because I just got back from the States. I don't know if you can see how jet lagged I looked. Those people who are listening clearly cannot. But
the graces of listening. Yeah.
But one of the things that I heard most on my trip in the United States was about the Matan podcast, about how much people love it and how much it adds to their weekly experience, generally preparing for Shabbos, but not always, right? Because that's just an easy way to be accompanied by Torah, right? And I think we at Matan really feel that we're happy to use many different media for spreading Torah. That's definitely something we started out, of course, like the whole world with frontal teaching, and we still really value the Beit Midrash and the ability to be in a classroom together. And especially after Corona, I think we particularly value the experience of live teaching. But at the same time, I think we've really grown to realize, especially since Corona, how valuable the different media are for spreading Torah, and perhaps the most accessible way for us to get Torah out there, the way that is most accessible for other people to experience Matan Torah is really through the podcast. And not only do you get to experience Yosefa every week, but each of her guests that she brings on, each of whom I think brings a whole world of knowledge and a new direction and new ways of looking at things. And I think that from what I've been hearing around the world, I think the podcast medium has been really a very, very wonderful one for Matan and for Torah and for spreading Torah in the world. So I think that this is a great reason to celebrate, to have this 100th podcast marker.
I think that something I was thinking about on my way here is that in a world that has become so visual, something that I love about the podcast is that it goes against that grain. Meaning there are podcasts out there that are taped and go up on YouTube, and that has its own merits. But I recently was realizing there's a particular podcast that I've been listening to that I really, really love. It's not a Torah podcast. And I realized recently that I have no idea what the host looks like. I feel like she and I are very close. Like, I've been listening to her a lot. She speaks about ideas that are really close to my heart. It's Barry Weiss, by the way. I'll just share that out there. But, and I realized that I would never know what she looks like if she walked by me in the street. And so I looked her up, and I said to my husband, we were in the car together, he looked her up, and I said, that's so countercultural right now, that like I feel that I've heard so many thoughts in this person, and I feel like there's like an intimacy there, but I have no idea what she looks like. And there's something a little bit about that like the podcast medium is almost like countercultural today to the visual culture that we have, that also makes me love it very much. It's like how people can think that I'm a very calm person because I have a very calm voice, but really you can come to my house at 6 p.m. and you'll discover something else. What we thought to do this evening was sort of discuss some questions surrounding teaching Tanakh. I'll also just say, just to sort of make order here, which is that Yael was my teacher. when I was a student in Matan, which was 13 years ago, 14, bad at math. So I was a student of Yael's, and I guess over the years, sometimes the gap, right, it can sort of close over time. And so I appreciate Yael very much as someone who's really helped me and helped me grow also in the world of Tanakh study and Tanakh teaching. And so we thought to discuss some questions. I'm going to pose them to Yael, but on this occasion, I'm also going to answer some of them myself as well. So we'll start with that. And then we also would love to open up if anyone else has questions that they want to ask. We'd love to hear that also. Okay? Great. First question I have for you, Yael, is what initially or still draws you to Tanakh study? And I would say more than other realms, right? You and I we both dabble in all different realms of Torah study, but what is it that sort of got you hooked into the world of Tanakh?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that, for me, that's not a very hard question because I think that today, studying Tanakh today in the land of Israel has something so unique about it. I mean, aside from the ability to go out into, and in Israel and do all sorts of tiyulim, which shows you the Tanakh coming to life and allows you to experience the Tanakh in a very visual and experiential way. Aside from that, I think so many of the topics also that the Tanakh deals with are so relevant for what we're dealing with today in Israel. This also, it came up all the time on this previous trip to America. So in one of the shuls where I spoke, the rabbi wanted to have an afternoon discussion with me. And the discussion that he wanted to have was, does the Jew of today look similar or different to the biblical Jew? Right? That was his question. And basically, I think what he was particularly interested in was the world of halakha, right? How much does the practice of the modern Jew look like the practice of the Jew in biblical times? And of course, when we talk about biblical times, we're talking about a very broad period in history. But, I said to him, it's a question that I can answer, but the answer is going to be filled with gaps, right? Because really the Tanakh is not so interested in the daily life and the daily ritual life of the individual Jew. The Tanakh is much more interested in nation building. It's much more interested in what it means to create a society, a healthy society, a viable society, a religious society, a society that is based on equity and justice and fairness and morality. And those issues, it doesn't mean that there weren't people practicing halakha. In this case, we have a lot of absence of evidence, which, as we know, doesn't always mean evidence of absence, right? Doesn't mean they weren't practicing halakha. It just means that that's not really what the Tanakh is interested in. What the Tanakh is interested in is issues of leadership, issues of how to create a welfare society, right? What it means to be a society that goes into war and maintains faith, right? What it means to set up an economic system that is one that reflects both a sense of justice and to create equity in society, but at the same time to have society have incentives to move forward. And all of these questions are questions that occupy us today, right? And there's so many, even just like the question of unity, right? Which is obviously one of the main questions that is on our mind today. I'm not saying we're doing it well, but I'm saying we are thinking about it. Yeah. We must be thinking about it. And because we're thinking about all these issues, we look very much like the biblical Jew. I think that actually probably represents a difference between what's going on in your average Israeli, Jew and your average American Jew. What kinds of things are you thinking about in your daily quest to live a Jewish life? So for me, I guess the answer, to sum it up in one word, is relevance. There's so much today about learning Tanakh that is so deeply relevant to what we're thinking about today as a nation who's really given this great opportunity for the first time in almost 2,000 years to rethink the central issues of the Tanakh.
Right. So you're saying that essentially what draws you into Tanakh today is that in a funny, ironic way, we're more similar, at least in our core thoughts and what occupies our minds and hearts, to what they were thinking in biblical times than perhaps what was occupying their life all the years in the more exiled existence.
Well, certainly to what the Tanakh is showing us. I don't know what they were thinking about in their daily life. And there is ritual practice. It's actually quite different, though. Most of the time they are thinking about things like korbanot and things that also chagim, Shabbat, general things that have a more communal experience to them. So it's not, obviously today we're also keeping halakha, and and our daily life looks similar to the daily life of a practicing Jew in America.
Yeah, but it's like the core philosophical issues you're saying are really similar.
Yeah, and we're rethinking them, and so they become that much more interesting and that much more central, and they rise to the forefront of our national existence. So that I think that makes some of these Tanakh questions really critical today.
It's interesting when I think about sort of what brought me into the Tanakh world. Now, I said that I also love learning halakha. It's maybe for a related reason, but so I know you also share this love. I love story, and so I always have a sort of a soft spot for narratives in Tanakh more than other kinds of text, whether it's, more poetic or legal. I think story is at the basis of all humanity. That's how we process the world. That's how we make meaning. And while there are many people who feel that they sense story, let's say in Talmudic literature, for me, there's nothing that tops story narrative in Tanakh. And actually what really brought me back into Tanakh learning was when I was initially exposed to literary study of Tanakh. And it actually happened in the opposite context. It happened in a literature class in college. But that's, for me, definitely one of like the hooks that got me really into Tanakh learning, when I realized that, they're related skills and I can use them because I studied writing and I studied Tanakh more in college. And so for me, narrative is something that just feels, to me, it's swimming in an ocean, which is like my favorite physical activity. It's just sort of something that's endless, and there's just an endless amount of meaning and an endless amount of layers that you can get involved in. And so that's one thing that really hooks me into Tanakh learning. And the other one is that, and this is a belief piece of mine, that I really believe that like the spiritual DNA of Am Yisrael is embedded in Tanakh. And so I sort of feel that when I learn Tanakh, more than when I'll learn Gemara and even halakha sometimes, I feel like, again, I'll use the image of swimming. I feel like I'm swimming in something that is so primal to who we are, that to me it's just a constantly inspiring experience. Whether I'm teaching a Mizmor of Tehillim and I'm like, well, this is what people were saying for thousands of years. There's something about that just sort of like never ceases to move me. So that to me is part of it. And when I learn, and again, I'm not saying anything negative, God forbid, about learning Gemara, but it just doesn't have the same impact for me. I tried for many years to force myself to be equally passionate, but it didn't work. And I just, there's something so primal to me about Tanakh that nothing parallels it for me at all. I don't know. I know you're also a lover of story.
Yeah, when you were saying it, I was thinking that in the past, let's say 10 years, I've really found a lot of love for biblical poetry, and particularly those sections of Tanakh that do speak to some of the events that I think really are current events. In other words, the sections of Tanakh that talk about Shivat Zion, or that allude to this period in history. I mean, I can't get through, through certain passages of Tanakh without feeling just overwhelmed by some of the contemporary relevance. Some of you, I see some of you in here, were with me in Yeshayahu, right? When we did the Pirkei Nechama in Yeshayahu. And I have almost this daily experience. I actually do have this daily experience of sitting in traffic. Anybody else? Anybody else, right? So this daily experience of sitting in traffic, and I'm thinking of Echaya Shavavadad Ha'ira Bati Am, right? I'm thinking of Yerushalayim, which is an empty city, a lonely city. And then I'm thinking of how Yeshayahu counters that image by promising Yerushalayim that one day you're going to wake up and say, Tsar li hamakom, Geshali ve'esheva, right? Like, this place is too narrow for me. Move aside. I need some room. I need some living space. And sometimes, when I am going through traffic, every day, I say to myself, as I'm driving along, I mumble to myself, Tsarli hamakom, it's our bracha, right? So I have found, I think,
they are widening the road. So you're saying the widening of the road of 60 is really a prophetic fulfillment of Yeshayahu.
It is absolutely, but what's going to happen is
a
that
nice perspective.
I'll think about it next week. It's too little, too late, right? So they widen the road, and by that point, Gush Etzion has doubled, and thank God, more and more people have cars. When I moved to Gush Etzion, I think many families didn't have one car, and now a lot of people have more than one car, and that's our bracha. It's a bracha of a society that has grown and has prospered, and these are wonderful things to see. And I think that I see so many of the prophetic promises and even Mizmorei Tehillim that describe some really, I think, remarkable visions. I see them coming to life, and I think to myself, how can one not feel that moved when you look at the Tanakh, and then you look around, you see how Am Yisrael is being given this opportunity, this reanimation, this revitalization, this experience of seeing some of the Tanakh prophecies coming alive, and I find myself really very swept up by that.
Beautiful. I love how none of our points, by the way, overlap with each other. No, I'm saying that in an amazing way, right? Meaning they all are, they're all very different pieces. And I'm sure that everybody who learns Tanakh has different pieces that anchor them. I want to actually ask you, what is the most frequently asked question that you meet in the Tanakh classroom?
I have to switch my
I know.
pages. No, this one I can do without looking, because I really do get this question a lot, especially when I travel. Again, in my classroom, probably the most frequent question is, "What pasuk did you say?" Right? Absolutely. Am I wrong? Right? I usually say every pasuk as I'm introducing it 3 times before anyone can ask. But no, really the most frequent substantive question, I assume that was what
I did
you
mean
meant.
that kind, yeah.
Especially when I travel is, but why do they sin so much? Right? There's this sense that the Tanakh is speaking to some kind of exemplary existence, some kind of ideal. We're looking to create an ideal. I talked about it a little bit before, right? We're looking to create an ideal society. We're looking to create an ideal family. We're looking to create ideal relationships. We're looking to create an ideal relationship with God, right? And none of this is actually true. I mean, it's all true. Everything I said right now is true, but none of it is actually the story of the Tanakh, which, by the way, I'm now going to answer the question that you were going to ask, which is the deepest point of comfort you take from Tanakh, and I'm going to mix these together.
Yeah,
okay, thank you. Which is that I really think that the point of Tanakh is not to say that one day we are going to have the ideal society, the ideal relationship with God, the ideal community, the ideal family even. I don't think that that's what the Tanakh is saying. I think the Tanakh is saying something that I take actually I think there's a lot of depth here, and I think that there's also a lot of comfort here. I also think there's a lot of honesty here, which is one of the things that I think is really magnificent about the Tanakh. And that is that the Tanakh is setting the bar very high. The Tanakh has very high expectations from us as individuals, as a community, as human beings who have the potential to reach something otherworldly, to reach something that seems to be theologically impossible, right? I think the Tanakh has great respect for human beings in this regard, and therefore sets the bar very, very high. But actually, one of the most important themes of the Tanakh is that human beings are fallible, and human beings are basically creatures who have lots of weaknesses. And eventually, even if we can reach some kind of an ideal, there are going to be fluctuations, right? There's going to be movements towards, movements away. There will be movements upward, and there will be a lot of downfalls. And so the other piece of the Tanakh is that even though God sets the bar very high, and the Tanakh sets the bar very high for us as individuals and as a nation and as a community, I think there's a constant awareness of human failure, and there are mechanisms that are set into place to enable us to rise again. And that's the story of the Tanakh. And that's the answer, I think, to the most frequently asked question, which is, why do we sin so much? Why is the Tanakh so filled with human foibles, with human fallibility, and with human weakness? And that's the story of, I think, what Judaism really is. I think it's a beautiful story. It's a story that is filled with both honesty and respect, and a certain awareness of what the world is. In this regard, I would say that my favorite Tanakh story, even though it's not my favorite Tanakh story of all time.
Yeah, you're mixing a lot of questions into one.
Can I just finish that though? Okay, because I'll say a different thing when you ask me that question. In this regard, my favorite Tanakh story is the story of David. Because, of course, the story of David is the story of a terrible, terrible downfall. Yeah. And yet, it believes in David's ability to eventually stumble back to his feet again. And with a great, great deal of difficulty and pain. And if you miss that story, you miss the greatness of Tanakh.
I mean, I think that's on the most basic level why the Torah starts where it does. Meaning, it starts with the creation of the world, but it starts with the first sin of Adam and Chava. Meaning, we're starting off with Tzelem Elokim, and then immediately it goes to a bummer, right? And I think that's exactly the point. It's this buildup of, this is the human potential you have. We're going to create it. It's very picturesque. And then we're going to show you what happens in real time. And then we're going to show you how we slowly crawl our way back to Avraham. Meaning, I think that's the arc, really, of the first 11 prakim of Sefer Bereshit. So I totally agree with that. I think that's very much, right? Tanakh, even like Halakha later does as well, is aspirational, essentially. And it's letting you know how high we can set the bar, and also very clearly that we're not always going to make it. And on an individual level, we have Adam and Chava. And then on a national level, we have Chet Egel. And I'll give a little spoiler for a episode that's coming out in another 2 weeks. But Leon Kass in his commentary says, by Chet Egel. You thought I was going to say something else?
No, I thought you were going to say that Leon agreed to come on for Chet Egel.
I know, but he's not in the end. I know.
Okay.
We'll try and get him next time. Yeah. So he says it there that he thinks that it wasn't only important, but it was necessary for Am Yisrael to sin in the golden calf. It's like a very, very audacious comment. It needed to happen in the same way that I'm connecting this, in the same way that Chet Egel needed to, that Chet Adam v'Chava needed to happen, also Chet Egel needed to happen on a national level, meaning there needed to be that, the bar was set so high, almost too high, that then there was going to be the reality that takes place. And then after that, they'll crawl their way back, right? They'll create the Mishkan in a different way, right? They're going to create a model that actually works. So I think that comes through very strongly what you said all throughout Tanakh. I teach students who are a little bit younger, I think. No, we have overlap also of ages, but I've found very much that what's come up for me in the last 2 years of this question of what question is often asked is the question of, did it really happen like that? Is this what really happened? And it's a question that comes up a lot in my classroom because, as I said before, I really, and you do as well, teach sort of a lot of literary style of teaching, and literary style of teaching doesn't necessarily care
all that much about this question. Okay. And there's a reason why this question comes up. It can come up in places like, the Exodus from Egypt, right? Which is its own sort of loaded question. And it can also come up in a smaller way of, well, the story is being told like this in Megillat Esther, but is that necessarily exactly how it played out? And well, if you're teaching it as a book and it has a written style, so then we have to also understand that sometimes with the written style, there's always going to be a difference. I always say to people, I could tell you about how my day was, right? I can also choose to tell you how my day was from what point I want to start. I could start from what I ate for breakfast. I could start from, where who I sat with at the lunch table. I could tell you about my day in all different ways. And the Tanakh is like that as well. It chooses how to tell the story. There are many ways one could tell a story. And so this is a question that often comes up for some people with more of like an internal theological earthquake than others. And there are different ways I sort of approach it depending on who's asking, how they're asking it. But I will say that one of the strongest lessons that I always think about is the difference between something having a truth or something being true, meaning it is without doubt that everything in Tanakh, exactly the way it is written, holds boundless truth in it. And whether or not the event happened, if I went back in time thousands of years ago and I would look at the event and describe it exactly like that, to me matters far less than what is the lesson, what is the meaning that I sort of was able to take out from this story, from the way, or this narrative, or from this halakha, whatever is being brought in front of us, or this poem is far more meaningful than the question of, did something happen the way it is? I'll just add one more piece, which is that question also comes from a very, I would say, early Western, almost sort of, Western way of thinking. We have a much more linear way of thinking that didn't occupy at all people's minds in the ancient world. People didn't care about being. We have a value today to saying, I saw this event, I witnessed it, and I wrote it down exactly as it happened. And that wasn't a value in the same way in the ancient world. And I believe that, Dibra Torah b'lashon b'nei Adam, certainly the b'nei Adam who were experiencing it when they were initially receiving the Torah, and it's not necessarily as important or critical for the Tanakh per se to be a perfect eyewitness in the same way that we value that today. So that's a question that comes up for me a lot, certainly with younger students, and my answer isn't always satisfactory to them.
I would just add one point, which is that the Tanakh is interested in theology. Yes. It tells theology through the prism of history, but history is not primarily what the Tanakh is doing. And a good example of that is Achav, right? Who we know from external sources how powerful he was militarily. And from internal sources, we're much more focused on how problematic his wife was, right? Of course, that's what the Tanakh is more interested in. And the theology of that, and how he was rather weak figure from a religious point of view. And he's, sometimes pulled by Eliyahu, sometimes he's pulled by Izebel, but from a military viewpoint, right, what we know about him, from the Kirch monolith, the fact that he contributed 2,000 chariots to the war effort against Shalmaneser III, that's 1,000 more chariots than any other of the allies who fought against him. That's something the Tanakh just kind of, didn't bother telling us that. Yeah. So that's just a good example of what the Tanakh is not trying to do, and I think that really is continuing your point.
So, if it's okay with you, I want to go to a little bit of a loaded question. Okay. And I want to ask you about is there a theological dilemma in Tanakh that you feel challenges you, whether in the way that Tanakh presents a certain topic or an actual theological idea that Tanakh itself reckons with? Is there something, I'm sort of looking for a challenge point for you when you read or learn or teach?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a macro and a micro, right? The macro question, I think, is really the basic Tanakh or human religious question, which is, what does it even mean to have a relationship with God? That's what the entire Tanakh is about, right? And that is something that I think that all religious people struggle with. And we read it, we see it, Moshe, panim al panim, right? Kasher yidaber ish el re'ehu, right? If it were not written, I could not say those words, right? God speaks to Moshe face to face like a person speaks to his friend. And that's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge to teach what that means. It's a challenge to understand what that means, to try to somehow endeavor to experience that. But that's a very general kind of answer. On a more, in a more specific answer, I think that, there are certain Tanakh stories that I can't imagine that any person doesn't struggle with. And if they don't, then I think that they're not reading it correctly. And the best example of this is Akedat Yitzchak. We're getting there for those of you in my Wednesday morning class. Bezrat Hashem, right? Akedat Yitzchak, I mean, what does it mean? What is God asking Avram to do? And why does he ask him to do it if he doesn't really want him to do it? Mm-hmm. Right? So, I mean, I can give the entire array of answers that we're going to find, and we will do that, right, on our source sheets. But what I really want to say at the end of the day is that chapter is unsettling. It's unsettling. And I think that might be the reason that we read it on Rosh Hashanah, because it's not necessarily the most obvious chapter to read on Rosh Hashanah. I might look for something, that has more about, I don't know, tshuva or something different, right? But that I think the idea is to sort of throw us, right? It unsettles. It should be troubling. And it remains troubling, and it should remain troubling. That's what, I think that there is value in not always resolving all of our questions, because ultimately we look at a world where human beings are not resolving all of our theological questions. And, that's something that I explore a lot when I talk about Echa in my book. And I think that on a narrative level, I feel it the most when I experience Akedat Yitzchak, and when I walk with Avram into that absurd test that he has to undergo.
It's interesting. I want to pick a little deeper at the macro that you mentioned, which is this idea of what does it actually mean to have a relationship with God? So I've been putting together the Vayikra series, which I'm going to start recording next week, and one of the ideas that a chavruta and friend gave to me, she said, well, why don't you explore what it really means to meet God? And I was like, I don't think I'm going to do that for Vayikra. And all the ways that Vayikra is suggesting to, and I said, this feels like a little bit too audacious for me. But it's for that reason, meaning it's for that reason that, by the way, the topic is Kedushas in the details. Just giving a little spoiler there for what's coming up in Vayikra.
Also audacious.
Audacious. But right? I've built the episodes. Yeah. I'm really excited. I didn't share with you since we last spoke. But this idea, I was just speaking to a student about this, how there are two things that we really don't have, and nor do we really want to describe directly in words. One is a relationship with God, and one is our romantic love in our life. There are two things that are so deeply intimate to us that there's a reason why words shouldn't do them justice, and why even, for example, in Shir Shirim, there's a lot of imagery that's used to describe it, but there's no, right? It's showing, not telling, because we don't really want to tell. And so that's how I really think about all of those really anthropomorphic, or what is Moshe and Hashem really doing? We're not supposed to get it. Do you know? Meaning, we don't want to get it, because like all things, we like to feel almost there, because there's something much more thrilling and moving, because when we have it and we can grasp it, it doesn't have that mystique. And so I feel like all those psukim about a relationship with God are meant to be filled with mystique, because if we really would get it, it wouldn't move us in the same way. There's something about the fact that it's elusive that keeps us on the edge of our seat. And so I also don't know, of course I don't know what it means. And I just today was editing the episode on Kitisa, and we tried to sort of talk about that question a little bit, of all those phrases that you just mentioned right now. And ultimately, it's a big question. I guess I'll just add one. I think there are a lot of moral questions that come up today, because a lot of things in Tanakh really they don't jive well with a lot of people's current modern moral sensibilities. Which doesn't mean that they're right. Moral sensibilities are just different than what a lot of Tanakh stories reflect. But for me, and I share this often when I teach, but one of the biggest dilemmas for me is really the concept of midah keneged midah, measure for measure, as it's often translated, which I've heard explanations for how to mitigate this, but it's a really basic theology in all throughout Tanakh. And I often, when I think about this topic, I really started thinking about it very much after my father had passed away a number of years ago. And I remember saying, if I would say to you, I'll say, in a class, or if I would say to you, well, clearly your father got sick because he was a sinner, right? Like that would be a very, very, very unfortunate way to start a conversation with me, right? So I think that that's one of the many examples of things that are difficult for us to sort of digest in our modern conception. But to me, it's such a problem because it's so basic to the way that so much of Tanakh functions, right? If you do bad, you're going to get bad. And I've heard approaches that try to say, well, this is true on a national level, but on an individual level, it's not. It doesn't really work that way. But there's a lot of stories about individuals in Tanakh who the narrative clearly frames it as they didn't do well, and so they received bad. And so I have a lot of thoughts about it, but I would just say as a bare bones answer, that's something to me that presents me with the greatest challenge, not on a personal daily level, but how to bridge what is often the message of a lot of narratives and texts in Tanakh with what would be acceptable to us today and the way that we would speak, right? We would never say that to somebody. Maybe the Tanakh is encouraging us to think like that, right? And to think introspectively when something really negative is happening. And anyways, it's a topic that speaks a lot to me, and I explored it with Tanya White in the series.
See, I think the Tanakh is a little more subtle than that. First of all, remember that the entire story of Am Yisrael starts in Egypt for no apparent reason, which all of the different Parshanim search for a sin, right? So is it Avram's sin? Because in the Brit Bein HaBetarim, Avram is already told that Am Yisrael is going to start out in slavery. But, the other possibility is that it's not always this midah keneged midah, this measure for measure. That sometimes there are other reasons that things happen and that bad things happen. And, Nechama Leibowitz, for example, explores at great length this idea that Am Yisrael has to start out its existence in slavery in order to create a moral foundation for a nation that will always be concerned about the weaker elements in society. And the flip side, I think, is also true, which is that, let's say, in the story of Yaakov, right, all of that deceit and trickery that's going on comes around very subtly. Because it's not, the Tanakh doesn't make this point of saying, you did X, you get Y, but rather that there's this kind of subtle weave, I think, that is often going on. So I don't know. I don't find that as glaring. Certainly there are situations and in a lot of, let's say, the legal sections.
Some big fundamental texts.
Yeah. But when we do actually go through it, for example, in Megillat Eicha is very, very has a very strong dialectic as to whether or not this is something that is, because of sins or because of some elusive reason that we absolutely cannot figure out. And even if there are sins, they're not proportionate to the ultimate fate of Am Yisrael. And so Eicha, when it does deal with theology, and I would say Eov as well, is engaging in a much more profound experience of theology. I'm not denying that there aren't sections in Tanakh
I agree with you that within, again, we're not going to do a whole shir, but I agree with you that within Tanakh, there are different perspectives on this topic.
Yeah.
I've actually quoted you on Eicha before when I've taught this.
I remember in your series with Tanya.
Yeah, exactly. I quoted you. So I agree with you that within Tanakh there is a certain multiplicity of voices, but there's also a very strong strain of this idea. So, but I agree with you. I that's what I'm saying. It's not something that perplexes me or challenges me on a daily basis, but it's something I think about when I try and think about how to import what we're learning into our regular lives. If I can move, I want to move to like a little bit of a lighter question. If that's okay with you.
I had no answer to this question.
Well, I had it right away. I knew which one you were going to ask.
I knew you would have it. I wanted to know, Yael, what is a Tanakh moment that makes you laugh or that you find humorous? I had nothing. I had nothing to write. I couldn't think of anything. I'm way too serious for my own good.
So I had a couple, but the one that immediately came to mind is in Shmuel Aleph Perek 10.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So I was thinking I'm supposed to say this, but I don't think it's funny.
I actually think it's quite hilarious. There's this moment when Shaul went to find his father's donkeys, right? And he can't find these donkeys, and he gives up, and he says, "You know what? Let's just go home. I don't want my father to be worried." And his servant, his boy, who doesn't get a name, says to him, no, let's go find the Navi. And Shaul says, well, I don't have anything to give to the Navi. I have no bread. We have no money. And the servant says, no worries. I have all this stuff. So the servant has everything that Shaul doesn't have. And they make their way towards the Navi, but they can't find him, right? Because, Shaul doesn't know exactly how to find the Navi, right? Yeah, he doesn't really know, right? So as they're walking, they see these girls who are coming back from having drawn water, okay? So what does that mean? He sees girls coming from the well. It's his betrothal scene, right?
He's supposed to get engaged right now.
He's supposed to get engaged. He sees these girls, right? So he turns to them and he says, Hayesh bazeh haroeh, is there a prophet in town? And this is the answer of the girls, okay? Vata'anena otam vatomarna, right? They answer him and they say, Yesh hinei lefanecha maher ata ki hayom ba la'ir ki zevach hayom la'am babama ki v'achem ha'ir kin timtze'un oto b'terem ya'aleh ha'bamata la'echol ki lo yochal la'am ad ba'o ki hu yivarech ha'zevach acharechen yochalu ha'kirurim v'ata alu ki oto hayom timtze'un oto. Okay, then when I teach this, right? So by the time I get to the end, I say, what did that mean? Can anybody translate that? And the answer is no, because it's nonsensical, right? It actually means nothing. Right? So the Gemara also picks up on it. And the Gemara says several things, some of which I won't say. I have no interest in saying that women talk a lot. I'm not going to say that. But I think the well-known answer of the Gemara is a kol kach lama. Lefi shayu mistaklot al yofio shel Shaul v'lo hayu sveot mimenu. Right? They were looking at Shaul. He was so handsome. He was tall and had this, comportment of a king. And these girls see him, and for them, it's their betrothal scene, right? They're coming from the well, and the Barbanel actually describes that they're all talking over each other, right? Everybody's talking over each other, like,
voices.
No, look at me. And what are they saying? They're saying absolutely nothing. And the Tanakh does, I think, a marvelous job of presenting this very lively, very funny scene where all these girls are saying absolutely nothing, but they just don't want Shaul to leave. Yeah, I know, he's right there. Just today, I saw him before. I think that he's doing that. No, don't worry. If you get there, you won't be too late. And you hear all these things that they're saying. And the actual, sort of ending of the scene is also funny, which is that the next pasuk is Vayalu ha'ir. He actually doesn't respond to them. And so there's this sense that Shaul, he misses his betrothal scene here, right? Or that's not what he's looking for, right? He's looking for the donkeys. He has a very, very, kind of tunnel vision going on here. It may also prepare us for something about, Shaul's lack of continuity. He's not going to have the ability to sustain his dynasty. Maybe we're also being prepared for that here, but that's not so funny. So I'm going to leave that aside. But I think that the actual
the technique, you're saying the technique
is great. It's just great, and it's a great moment in a classroom because, you said you're serious. I tend to be a little too serious. I'm always amazed by, my colleagues who can make jokes in front of, in classrooms. That's not my skill. But I do think that the Tanakh sometimes does it for us, so that's fun.
The same technique is also used in the book of Yonah, where we also have the multiplicity of voices of the sailors who ask 7 questions to Yonah at the same time, and that's the Parshanim speak about the fact that they were all asking at the same time, and that's why it's 7 questions in a row. But it's a similar technique. But I have nothing to add to this. I don't know. I don't find myself laughing over Tanakh. It just doesn't happen to me very often. There are things that I love, which maybe I'll ask that, meaning about
about a favorite parak or pasuk or maybe even a midrash that comes to mind, something that you just like love.
Do you want to answer first?
I could answer first.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I don't totally have a reason why, but definitely a favorite parak of mine is the second chapter of Shmot. I love the birth of Moshe. I think that to me, it sort of like holds in it sort of like the secrets of everything else that comes after, not just in the book of Shmot, but even broader than that. I love the appearance of all the women. I think that's also probably a favorite of mine. And I just think that it's one of the most masterfully constructed prakim. I don't know, something about it. I don't have a reason why, but it really, really, really moves me. I did also spend a lot of time in it for my doctorate. So usually after things you write in your doctorate, you hate later. But I actually ended up liking that one in the long run. So I love that scene. And I love the division of sort of his birth and then his youth. And, we're given the information is so paltry that we have about our biggest heroes. And so to me, it's just like, it's that one peek we have into the background of Moshe. And I feel like it just really holds all of the secrets that we'll need to know later on. Yeah. Did you want to respond to that though?
No, I agree with you. I mean, that was not the one that I picked, but definitely Shmot Parak Bet is a magnificent parak. I think it also appeals to our literary interest.
Yeah.
It has such a wonderful structure that really so nicely reflects the meaning. So it's also, for me, it's a go-to parak to try to demonstrate different literary techniques and how form always reflects meaning. So that
I'm trying to think, maybe I learned it with you. Maybe we did that all those years ago in the Tanakh program here. That's definitely a favorite parak. I definitely my favorite section in all of Tanakh is the first 11 chapters of Bereshit by far. I also, it's for the same reason. Something fascinates me about feeling like I'm digging into like the most primal piece of things. And so to me, I love teaching Bereshit Aleph through Aleph. I think that it holds in it the keys to all of human functioning, including, as you said, all of our failings. To me, that's just, there is really nothing better for me than the first 11 chapters of Bereshit. And I couldn't think of one pasuk that I loved. And I knew I was going to regret that later because I know that I have, and I'm just not thinking about it right now. But I did think, in honor of Purim that's coming up, that the phrase "Vatilbash Esther Malchut" is one of the most moving phrases to me. This idea that, well, obviously literally, right, she got dressed up to have the appropriate audience with the king, but the idea that like the clothing makes the person, I'll swap out the man part, the clothing makes the person, that she needed to assume an identity. And so, a little bit fake it till you make it. To me, there's just a real like essential teaching there about the fact that we can transform ourselves when we need to, like we have that ability within us, and that we're all princesses. I have 4 daughters. I think I've said that 75 times on the podcast. It may be an essential feature of my life.
It's about to change in whatever way.
In whatever way, it's about to change. So yeah, this to me, because also I guess there's, as a side topic, there are parts of Megillat Esther that I deeply struggle with in terms of like the broader story. But that to me, more than Revach v'Atzala yavo b'makom acher, like that moment to me is when Esther really, really steps it up and she becomes exactly who she needs to be in that right moment. So that stuck out of my mind because I'm teaching Megillat Esther right now, but I'm sure I'll go home later tonight and think of other things. But yeah, I was curious what
rises to that royal stature, especially in light of the fact that so many of the Bnei Rachel rip clothes instead of using clothes. So she does something actually quite different than her colleagues. And like you said, she steps into the role. She says, I'm going to use it for good, the beauty and the regality. So yeah, that is I think a remarkable moment.
What are yours, Yael?
Okay, so it's really hard. It's like asking for a favorite child, like 7. Right? Okay, no. So I'll just do one favorite parak because, as I said, right now I'm really much more in the direction of biblical poetry than narrative. So, and don't take this really as favorite. I'm just going to just throw out a parak there. And that is Kuf Bet in Tehillim.
Oh,
and for the
I'm
same
writing on
reason.
that right now. Yeah.
Oh,
Love it.
Yeah. For the same reason that I said before, which is
so
the contemporary relevance of it. You have this beginning section of the parak, which is describing the horrors of some national calamity, right? This, description, it starts, of course, Tefillah la'ani ki ya'atov, right? V'lifnei Hashem yishpoch sicho. This is something that we sing, right? It's the tefillah where we're pouring out our hearts to God. And there's this description of Ki chalu ve'ashan yamai ve'atzmotai kimoked nicharu, right? My life goes up in smoke, right? My bones are being burned, right? I mean, to me, this is such 20th century imagery that it's hard for me not to feel that these descriptions relate to things that we are currently thinking about. But what's really remarkable, I wouldn't choose a parak about the Holocaust, obviously.
Yeah, I was going to say you're going down a very non-you route.
But also it's really not my personality so much. I tend to have a more cheery kind of outlook. But I mean,
when we schmooze, I like to say that she's the sunshine on the cloud. But yeah, okay.
And as we progress through the parak, all of a sudden there's this 180-degree switch in Pasuk Yud Gimel. Ve'ata Hashem le'olam teshev v'zichrecha l'dor v'dor, which is a pasuk that we also have at the end of Echa, right? But you got it forever. You're eternal, and therefore, you can do anything. You can change things over an instant. And in the next pasuk, we went from 1945 to 1948 in the span of 3 years, right? Or 2 psukim, right? Suddenly it's Ata takum terachem Tzion v'yir'u goyim et Shem Hashem, right? The nations will see God. Ki vanah Hashem Tzion, because God built Tzion. Ki hishkif mimarom kadsho lishma en kat asir. God is listening to the cries of the prisoners. B'hikabetz amim yachdav u'mamlachot la'avod et Hashem. To me, this is the breadth of the history of the past 100 years. And I read this and I think, I don't know, how did people understand this 100 years ago? And there are a lot of passages in Tanakh that I feel that about, not just the one that I sort of jokingly talked about before when I was talking about sitting in traffic, but so many. I mean, I remember when we had the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, right? Remember we had, 40 heads of states that came to Israel, and this was right before the outbreak of Corona. And I remember that as I was watching, it went on for like 2-3 hours. Did you see it? I think it was a Thursday afternoon, because I was definitely cooking and crying and watching it, all of this happening at the same time. And I sent out, I remember on my family WhatsApp, I looked at this pasuk from Yeshayahu Perek Samech, and the pasuk says, "V'halchu elayich shchoach b'nei ma'anayich." Right? Remember, the president of Germany was there as well, right? All of the sons of those who tormented you will now come bowing before you. V'ishtachavu al kapot raglayich kol mena'atzayich. Sorry, but the word Nazi is in there. I mean, I don't mean to get like weird
Bible codes
to get Bible codes on you, but there is this moment of they will bow down on the ground, all of these people who tormented you. V'karulach ir Hashem Tzion Kadosh Yisrael, right? And they're going to call you the city of God, right? So there was this moment, and then I sent that pasuk out, and an hour later, Amit Segel sent it out also on his WhatsApp group or whatever it was. So I said, Baruch shekivanti. But there was that sense that, there are psukim that are just sort of, materializing, ki ayin be'ayin yir'u b'shuv Hashem Tzion, this pasuk that Rav Kook loved to cite from Yeshayahu Nun Bet. These are moments in the Tanakh that I find very moving. They're not necessarily my favorite psukim or my favorite prakim, but they're ones that I find endlessly laden with meaning.
I'm going to just jump in for a second because I just want to connect what you said now with your first answer.
Yeah.
Because they're really the same spectrum, right? What seems to move you the most is the relevance, and even the idea that I'm not even sure how they got it when it was first said, because the relevance seems to echo so much stronger today. And it's really interesting because what seems to move you is how it connects to what's happening today. And then when I speak about Tanakh, I say that I love feeling like I'm doing like a deep dive into like the DNA, meaning how it got started. So it's like funny that we're putting ourselves like on different ends of the spectrum, which is cool. It's nothing other than an observation.
I will just make a further observation that when we talked about, I said maybe we should talk a little bit about archaeology, and you weren't so interested in talking about archaeology. And I will say that for me, archaeology is the nexus between my two great loves, aside from my family. My family is my great love. But aside from that, my two great loves, which are Tanakh and Zionism, right? I am moved to live at a time that these two things can come together. I think I'll tell you a great story, right? So I think of this story of Eliezer Sukenik, right? You know who Eliezer Sukenik was? Right? So he's the professor of archaeology. He was famously the father of Yigal Yadin, right? That's probably his most famous claim to fame. But actually, what I think he is most famous for, what he should be most famous for, is that he was the first one to see the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so he was a professor of archaeology at Hebrew University, and he got notice that, there was some antiquities dealer that had bought from some Bedouin, from some Bedouin tribe, these 3 scrolls. And he was asked to come and look at them and see their veracity. And it was 1947. It was on the eve of, it was November 1947 that he got this request. And he turned to his son, Yigal Yadin. And Yigal Yadin famously writes in his journal, he said, well, I told him that as a military man, I thought it was inadvisable. As a son, I thought it was inadvisable. But as an archaeologist, right? I don't know. I mean, it seemed pretty advisable. Anyway, of course, Sukenik does go down, or he does go to see these scrolls. And the day that he saw the scrolls was November 29th, 1947, which was the day of the UN partition vote. And he writes in his journal, these scrolls were put away on the eve of the loss of Jewish independence 2,000 years ago. And they were waiting for us. And they reemerged on the eve of the reassumption of Jewish nationhood on November 29th, 1947. For the first time in almost 2,000 years, a Jewish person saw these scrolls again, and they were scrolls of Tanakh, and they created this continuum. It was a continuum of our connection to the land and our connection to Tanakh and our connection to building nationhood in this land. So for me, that's a very symbolic story, and it's also very emblematic of what I'm looking for right now. It may not be the only thing that I look for in Tanakh, but when I do teach these sections of Tanakh, for me it's a very overarching experience. It speaks to many different aspects of what I think is remarkable about being a Jew at this time.
It's interesting. I'm sort of doing a little bit of self-analysis as you're speaking, and I'm thinking about that because I'm thinking that I guess it doesn't make its way so much into what I teach, but it actually is a massive part of why I chose to live in this country. So I don't know why. I don't have an answer to that, but I'm thinking about how I remember that when I was in seminary for the year, and I didn't do so much Tanakh learning that year, to be quite honest, but one of the wonderful teachers that we had, I remember we were on a tiyul, and this concept of like a Tanakh tiyul, like I never met this concept before in my life. I'd never really been in Israel before. And they stuffed all of us into this cave. It was probably one of the Bar Kochba caves. I don't even remember anymore. And he had this like really beautiful, he still does, Rav Shinkalevsky, shout out if anyone here knows who he is. But he's a rabbi in Beit Shemesh, and he started reading in his really resounding voice of Maskila David Beoto B'Merat Tefillah of Mizmor 142. And this idea of, again, forget even all the words surrounding it, but David being in a cave. And I don't even remember what happened. I remember that we sang, but it was that moment of connecting Tanakh to the reality we were living that
without a doubt, is actually one of the main reasons why it became clear to me very quickly in sort of one of my first encounters in Israel that this is where I clearly had to live. And I would even say that where I eventually now live, and it seems will live, please God, for many coming years, that the feeling that Tanakh is sort of just springing forth from where I'm looking outside is undoubtedly one of the things that anchored me and drew me, and I mean, I would say even like eternally bound me up with this place. So I agree with you in terms of how moving it is. For some reason, I'm not sure why. It makes it less into the ways that I teach, but to me, it was just one of the most powerful reasons why I could never be anywhere else. I wanted to open up if anyone in the audience has any questions. If you don't, that's also right. We can keep going forever, Yael and I.
Right. But we won't.
We won't. Don't worry, we won't. We're going to.
See, I'm jet lagged, so for me, it's getting earlier, right? The rest of you,
she's just getting going.
First of all, thank you. This has been awesome. A question that I have as somebody beginning to teach Tanakh myself, my students struggle a lot with, now that they're finally reading the Psukim because they've never read them and they've been told stories and they don't know what's Peshat and what's Midrash. As they read the stories about these biblical heroes, they don't like them very much. My students especially struggle with Yaakov in a very real way. And to go back to your question, like the idea of modern morality, they're like, he's a terrible son. He's a terrible father. How do you deal with students who really, again, this modern morality question, when Tanakh seems to disagree with their modern morality, and how do you tell them that their hero, relate their heroes back to them when their heroes seem so far from them?
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah.
You want to start?
Yeah. I mean, part of it, I think, is what I was trying to say before when I spoke about what I think is really maybe the most asked question, right? So your question is subsumed under what I see as the most asked question, which is why so much sinning? Why so many things that seem to be deviating from the course that the Tanakh is showing us? I mean, Yaakov, I think, has, each story has to be learned in its own context. But I think the larger answer to these questions is that the Tanakh is showing us human beings in all of their struggles, in all of their downfalls, and their sort of getting back to their feet again. One of the things that we really see with Yaakov, and this speaks to, I think, also something that we were talking about earlier, which is that, there's a very subtle kind of straightening up of Yaakov, right? Yaakov goes from Yaakov to Yisrael, which is the twisted to the bent to straight. Yeah. And I think that the Tanakh does a very kind of, I think, a very beautiful job of showing how Yaakov's life becomes a series not just of the things that he does wrong, but also the ways that his life is teaching him what he's doing wrong. So, look, I mean, it's not an easy question. And part of, I think, the reason that we struggle with the question is because the Midrashim often have simplified and reduced some of our figures to simple good, simple bad, right? So anyone who's good is all good, and anyone who's bad is all bad. And the Tanakh doesn't do that. And I think that is, in my mind, that speaks to the Tanakh's realization that our heroes need to be people who also stumble and also teach us the mechanisms for recovery from those stumbles. So that's the best I can do short of going into the stories. But I do think that is the most important question. And that's the question that really I was addressing before in a more broad sense.
So it's, when you asked that question, it brought me back to, I think it was probably at this point 4 years ago. And I don't really usually teach in like a seminary setting, but I was in one for a few months teaching, and I taught Megillat Ruth, and I failed until the end to convince them that Ruth and Boaz were respect-worthy figures. And I had that same experience. I was horrified by my own failure. Meaning, we finished, and they were like, "Yeah, I don't know. It didn't really do anything for me." I was
it sent me home thinking, certainly about how I was teaching or what was happening in this interaction with the students. And it was like this really intimate setting. We sat around a table and so first of all, I get it. I get that feeling. And I was a little bit traumatized myself by it. And if I even say, because, if I had to pick my, favorite biblical protagonists, that they were up there, but I get it. And there's something also very upsetting about that response. I think that it just as a compliment to what Yael was saying now, which is that I think that not even connected to the Midrash, but I think sometimes we have to start off with speaking with students about what does it mean to be a hero, meaning to go back to that fundamental question. It's the same answer you gave, just sort of like framing it differently. Of a hero, we tend to think of a hero as somebody who is perfected, and we like to pretend that people function that way. But nobody, there are people that are born with greater potential than others, or born with sort of capacities that are far beyond other people's potentials, whether their level of energy or how many things they could do at the same time, or how much they could think or contemplate, or their spiritual potential of how close they could be to a world that you can't see. But I think that first, we have to sort of unpack this question of, what does it mean to be a spiritual hero? Tanakh is never going to present, unless they're a flat character, Tanakh is never going to present them as being someone who didn't have struggles, whether within themselves or with other people. So I think that there has to be some sort of ground rule setting, not only about what language do we use to speak about our, biblical heroes, which I think is an important conversation to have also in many settings. We have to sort of set the ground rules of the kind of language that's appropriate and not appropriate, which is a wide variety of language depending where we're teaching. But I think also this question of who are the people that you look up to even outside of Tanakh? Let's start with that, right? And some people really are attracted to the perfect kind of figures. I tend to find that largely as people get older, they shy away from that, and the people who sort of stick in their life longest as role models are people who they've seen struggle, and they've seen them emerge from those struggles and come out with new layers to humanity, with new amounts of depth, and so that's not everybody. It's certainly not going to speak to every high school 18-year-old, but I think that I would sort of try and unpack some of those basic questions with them before even getting to the actual text.
We have no perfect biblical figure.
Yeah, no one.
Not one.
No one, unless they're not really known. Charvona, he's perfect. But
Chazal say he's shy, right? Ishai had never sinned. Okay, so that's right.
But that's my point. My point is that they're only perfect if we see very little of them.
Yeah, exactly.
The second you're going to see more of somebody, you're going to see that they have freckles,
Yeah.
Especially,
I think the family thing is also a really interesting kind of, we talk about it, let's say, not perfect in terms of sinning, and not perfect in terms of the relationship with God, not perfect in terms of their relationship to the nation. But I think this idea, family's complicated, right? And
by the way, not just to self-promote both of us, but that was a great episode we did on sisters, on Rachel and Leah. We did for the Breshit, which, by the way, the Breshit series was okay. I'm not going to say picking a favorite child, but I love that one. So, but
you have to pick a favorite episode in the favorite series. No,
I can, by the way, I totally can, but I won't do it in public. So, but you spoke to that really well. So I also want to just reference anyone who's going to be listening to this at home, that idea about imperfect within the family and struggling with family, which Tanakh is so good at bringing to the fore. We really unpacked a lot of that.
See, I think what's beautiful about all of this is that so many of the struggles that we have today, we can find them in the Tanakh. And, you look at the fact that, the Avot were dealing with how to pass on values to the next generation. Right. So we sort of think we invented that one, right? Every generation thinks that they invented that one, right? There's never been a generation like today with kids who have left the path of their parents, right? Except that there's been every single generation until today, right? I mean, it's part of the story of humankind, is that we are struggling to have an ideal life in a world where we're not ideal, right? And I think that is it's very valuable. To me, it speaks to the honesty of Tanakh and the genuineness of what the Tanakh is trying to teach us.
And which, by the way, is one of the main reasons why I think people didn't learn it for many, 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 many years. Because Tanakh, certainly in a very difficult world of Galut, right, it was much easier just to reference it as through Psukim, through the Gemara, because Tanakh presents us with a much messier reality than I think up until pretty recent history people wanted to really see up close. And I think that's a big piece of it. It's we got very used to the prism of halakha, midrash halakha, and that didn't necessarily pick out easy things over hard things, but you didn't have to reckon with like these moral questions and the narrative in the same way. And I think that we are, the past few generations, I'm indebted to all those people who started doing that. I think they really picked up that quest and to try and make meaning out of really messy situations. And I think that it's something that is renewed, not new, but renewed in the world. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel Wruble, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Matan's website. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review in the comments. Please send us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.